Okay, let's quickly try and break these documents down in layman's terms, because apparently Hitler doesn't want me to sleep. So the first motion was inflammatory evidence. Now, the court denied Koberger's first motion in limine because it was too vague. He didn't identify specific evidence he wanted excluded as exceptionally inflammatory. The judge emphasized that decisions on potentially prejudicial material must be based on context and relevance. However, due to the graphic nature of this case, the prosecution must give advance notice to the defense before presenting such material. And basically, the defense can raise objections to this, but it will be outside the jury's presence if needed. Basically, another way of looking at it is these determinations should be made in context during the trial. The second motion was the defense trying to prohibit certain words like schmurder, schmurderer, schmurdered, and schmurderweapon, and similar forms of the word schmurder as applied to the defendant. Now, this was denied as unnecessary. The court found no indication that the state intended to use that word out of its appropriate context. The states also acknowledged the use of such improperty and has agreed to adhere to the evidentiary rules. The next motion would be the use of the terms psychopath and sociopath. Now, this motion has been granted. The court agreed that these terms are irrelevant and unfairly prejudicial, especially in the absence of the evidence supporting such diagnosis. The state is prohibited from using these terms in the guilt phase of the trial, unless the defense opens the door to such evidence. Next would be improper DP comments. The state filed a motion to prevent the defense from making comments about the DP that could be seen as inflammatory or improper. Specifically, the phrase that the state is intending to the defendant. Now, the defense counsel were the ones that had used this language in prior hearings. However, the defense agreed to use language that aligns with statutory guidelines and jury instructions, which is just basically formal and appropriate. Now, the court ruled that there was no need for a formal order for the defense to act professionally, since they've already acknowledged that they need to comply with proper legal language. And the court said that they're trusting the defense to follow these standards during trial. Therefore, that motion was denied as unnecessary. The next motion would be unnoticed 404B evidence. So the specifics of this was the defense were concerned about evidence such as the defendant's pre-homicide traffic stop, his graduate paper on crime scene investigation, and his Amazon purchase history. Now, these were argued to be other acts under 404B and thus inadmissible, unless they were disclosed and analysed for their relevance to character. The court clarified that IRE 404B does not automatically apply to any evidence of other acts. So, to really quickly break this down, this rule is specifically about excluding evidence only when it's used to suggest a person's criminal propensity or character. In other words, the rule prohibits the use of past acts simply to argue that the defendant has the tendency to commit crimes. The court, yet again, when addressing this, also said that they feel like the defense had misinterpreted what 404B even is. So to come out of law language for a second and really break this down for you. So to really break this down away from the use of law language, the defense was stating that because Brian Koberger was pulled over for the violation of not wearing a seatbelt, that shouldn't be used as evidence because that doesn't prove that that's the reasoning why he went to kill those 4 kids. The state were basically saying that no, that's not at all what they were intending to use that for. They were intending to use the make and model of the car from the night, which shows that he's obviously close to the area, and it also matches the description of CCTV that the defense also want removed. Because to a jury, this shows a clear indication of the defendant's car up close, as well as from multiple CCTV angles from the night the crime took place. They also stated that this forensics paper that he did was basically irrelevant, but it's not irrelevant when you put it into the context of what he's being accused of, as well as the lack of DNA left at the crime scene and the knowledge that the individual had to have done such things. So for the defendant's graduate paper and Amazon purchases, the court ruled that these don't directly suggest criminal propensity or character issues, so they don't fall under 404B. They also emphasised that there's still ample time before trial, being 4 months, for the state to file any future 404B notices if it intends to introduce this evidence under this rule. And the courts trusted that the state will fulfil this legal obligation to disclose this evidence, and ruled that any objections to the evidence could be made later when it's formally noticed. So this motion was denied, with the court asserting that the state can still file notice of 404B evidence. The timelines of any evidence will be reviewed closer to trial. Next would be the motions on the IGG. Now, this was quite simply granted because both parties agreed to exclude. They're just going to go on the basis that they received a tip. Next would be conditions as aggravator. So the defendant filed a motion to prevent the state from using his ASD as an aggravating factor in the penalty phase of the trial. Ironic that he calls out a lot of what the state do as premature while he does this in the penalty phase of the trial. Mate, they've not even selected a jury yet. Anyway, the state responded that it had no intentions of using this as an aggravating factor. They have actually indicated that they will review or argue its diagnosis if the defense want to bring it up as a mitigating factor, which is something that could potentially lessen the severity of the sentence. While the state's already conceded that it's not using this as an aggravating factor, the court was actually concerned about the broad scope of the defendant's motion. The defendant wanted to prevent any mention of his ASD or its symptoms, but the court has recognised that the range of ASD symptoms is rather large. So during the trial, the defence can basically argue that certain actions, characteristics and his behaviour are symptoms of his ASD. And at this point, no evidence has been presented to the court to even review. So the court decided to grant the motion in part. It prevented the state from using the defendant's ASD as an aggravating factor. It did not rule on whether any actions or behaviours related to ASD symptoms could be excluded from evidence. So the court left open the possibility that such evidence could be contested later if it arose during trial. So the ruling effectively blocked one specific use of the ASD diagnosis, but left room for future challenges depending on how the evidence unfolds. The next motion will be in part 2.